First, I think that the Western idea of experimentation is just going to go wild. And most of these substances have been mixed before, some of them dangerously, and some of them are okay too. There isn't any kind of tradition that sits behind it. And so because of that, it's a blank slate. There's nothing we can go to and say, oh, we understand what these ultimate outcomes are going to be. And we can't go to any kind of, indigenous society and say, what has been your experience over the last generations of information that you guys have passed down? I used to be really against these kinds of things because I was so deep in, our own lineage in the Amazon and really focused just on that. But I ultimately came to soften my views, recognizing that there's a movement beyond the neo-shamanic revolution to really a psychedelic renaissance. And that could ultimately be really positive if it's done in a positive way. And so when I hear of people just taking substances and mixing them together, I think that they're not understanding ultimately the sophistication necessary of like the amounts of different substances and whether they're really good combinations. And I think because of the legislation, and drug control over the last years, there isn't enough understanding about this. There hasn't been enough science. There aren't enough studies. And so we're now in another experimentation phase. I think it's really important to language that experimentation phase correctly, that these are people experimenting. They're giving names to these substances. What ultimately is supposed to come from that, I don't know. But I think it's very clear that we're branching away from traditional practices that are well understood or Western psychedelic practices that are also well understood, right? And we're moving away from like ketamine, positive or negative, has a long history of science behind it. And ayahuasca, positive or negative, has a long history of indigenous use sitting behind it. Now you come together and you start to intermix all these different plants and chemicals together, and you get different kinds of designer drugs. Maybe some of those will ultimately be positive, but I think there's going to be a lot of misses. And I think that that's ultimately really dangerous and we need to be careful about it.
Yeah, I think so too. And, part of the reason why I'm so passionate about integration is because I'm not immune to this. This is something that I've gone into where it's a slippery slope of where you want to experiment with so many different things. And how many times do we see someone similar to myself that's brand new to this world that gets opened up to it and then wants to try everything, right? And I think that's where the discernment really needs to come in, where perhaps more educational resources for people to hear this message, whether they will or not, but also for facilitators to be like, no, like this person's new, let them integrate, right? Whatever they're working with. And maybe when we're talking about these, as you put it, designer drugs, here's a little Sheeval saying hi. This little kitty's cute. She's great. But these designer drugs and whatnot, like maybe that's for the vets as opposed to people new to medicine.